right, welcome everybody. This is IWP Standard Time. We're only running 5 minutes late, which means we're on time. And those of you familiar with Latin American culture, that means we're actually quite a bit early. My name is Paul Poyer. I'm a research professor here at the Institute of World Politics. Latin America is something that the United States has historically, for the last several decades at least, not spent enough attention on, in my opinion, strategically and for other reasons. It has been considered sexy to look at the Middle East, to look at Russia, to look at China, and those are all really important issues. But what happens in the Western Hemisphere is of vital importance to the United States strategically, and I would argue morally as well. And my own wife is from Venezuela, which is one of the reasons why I've started to look more carefully at it for the last few years. One of our friends is Joseph Humire. He is a friend and also a scholar. Joseph, I wouldn't say he's an ex-Marine because you never say that about a Marine. He is the head of the Center for a Secure Free Society. He does consulting. We've got a very, very long bio here. I'll keep it short. Joseph does a lot of things. You can call him an international man of mystery, but one that thinks as well about a lot of different topics. He does consulting with the intelligence community and the military and the U.S. government, State Department, et cetera, for very good reasons. He watches these events in Latin America and the international dynamics quite closely. And what's going on in Venezuela right now is taking place in the context of a lot of dramatic changes all through the region. You have dramatic changes in Bolivia, which Joseph's ancestry is Bolivian. You've got major changes taking place right now in Argentina with the new election that brought the Peronists back to power. You've got huge street protests in Chile. You've got challenges in Colombia. You've got AMLO in Mexico, bringing Mexico in a new direction, bringing him an entire relationship with Cuba, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things going on right now. So Venezuela is only one of those many countries in flux, but it's the one in which all of America's opponents and frankly enemies are all present and in a very malignant fashion, using their base in Venezuela to target the United States' strategic interests. And some of the most important of those are who we're here to talk about today: Iran and Hezbollah. So join me in welcoming Joseph Humire.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, thank you, everybody. I have to apologize for a second for my voice. I thought it was a good idea to travel to New York without a coat over the weekend, and so I picked up a little bit of a head cold. So I will just make sure my voice carries through. It was actually about 5 years ago today since I was here at IWP, so I'm delighted to be back. I very much respect John Linchowski, the work of the university. I think you guys are a very unique university that does a lot of things related to national security, including Latin America. And actually one of my old friends and colleagues and mentors that was a former professor here, which is Professor Norm Bailey, who's now in Israel. So I have a lot of respect for the work of the university, and it's an honor and privilege to be at the university again. In 2014, when I was here for the first time, I actually was presenting about Iran in Latin America. It was at the period where I published a book. I co-edited a book called Iran Strategic Penetration in Latin America. One of those chapters in that book was Venezuela, but obviously we were looking at the region as a whole. And because of that, it was at a time when it was very nascent, that issue, and not a lot of people were talking about it, but we were able to get some traction. Now, you kind of fast forward 5 years, I'm back, and now I'm going to talk about Venezuela, a topic that I've also been looking at for quite a long time, and I think many people in the audience have been examining even longer than I have. But now I think in talking about Iran or Hezbollah in Venezuela is not so much of a kind of like a come out of the crazy corner of Washington D.C. It's actually a very real thing. Matter of fact, prior to coming in here today, I was scrolling through my social media, and a very prominent Venezuelan journalist, someone that does a lot of coverage. Actually, she probably covers about half of my Instagram whenever I review it. Carla Angola, who some of you may know from EBTV, posted an interview she gave with the Undersecretary for Terror Finance, a gentleman named Marshall Billingsley. And Marshall Billingsley said in a question and answer with Carla Angola, when she asked him about Hezbollah in Venezuela, he confirmed something that we suspected, which he confirmed that in April of this year, in a trip that the Foreign Minister of Venezuela, Jorge Ariasa, went to Beirut, that he met with the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. So that meeting took place. That was confirmed today by the Undersecretary of Terror Finance. He also mentioned that they're going to be working very closely to document and to reveal more about the relationship with Hezbollah and Venezuela. And so I think this is a very timely opportunity to talk a little bit about this. When me and Paul first started to talk about, the idea of coming and talking about this topic, because I think what you hear in the media most, you hear mostly about Cuba. I think there's a lot of been reporting on the Cuban presence in Venezuela. You're lately hearing a lot more about Russia. You even hear China. Obviously, the economic presence is very large. But you might hear about Iran, or you might hear about Hezbollah, but you don't really see anything. It's very, very rarely does anyone produce any kind of evidence or any kind of analysis that's concrete on the Iranian Hezbollah presence. To the point that I think a lot of Venezuelans think it's a bit of a myth. They think, we've heard this rumor of Iran and Hezbollah in Venezuela, but we're waiting for someone to show us. So I think what I told Paul, as I said, before we just come in here and give you a bunch of slides and talk about case A, case B, case C, and give you a bunch of Arabic names, Lebanese or Syrian names that no one's going to understand, and it just kind of be like a show and tell. I thought, for strategic reasons, let me take a little bit step back and talk a little about the origins. And this is actually a variation of a brief that I've given more than a dozen times. I think this is only the second time I've done it publicly, only the first time with the camera in front, so I guess this will be now public. But this is actually a variation of a longer briefing I've been giving to the Ministry of Defense in Brazil, the Ministry of Defense in Colombia, and as Paul mentioned, obviously the Department of Defense here in the United States, to truly get to the heart of what is going on in Venezuela. What is at the origin of this crisis, which I consider more as a conflict today. Let me see if I know how to work this. So I think this is the obvious, right? I think what grabs everybody's attention when it comes to Venezuela, beyond the humanitarian conditions, beyond the political crisis, beyond everything, the threats, the presence, that what really makes this kind of an anomaly in many sense is the economic situation. And that's, I think, fundamentally going to drive this conflict to a point where the United States is going to, and it already is, but will even increasingly have to deal with in different terms. The decline of the economic deceleration of Venezuela, it's faster than almost anything we've seen in modern history. It's much faster than the fall of the Berlin Wall, the decline of the Soviet Union. Zimbabwe and Greece are recent economic basket cases that didn't work. But for 50% of your GDP to essentially evaporate in a little bit more than 4 years, it's not an easy thing to do. And so when I began to start to look at this, it was almost as if I wanted to understand, how does something like Venezuela take place? How do we get to a situation where the economy is spiraling down, where there's inflation at 1,000,000% or more, the things that we haven't seen in modern history. The explanations that you would constantly hear among the politicians in the press is, the first one is the obvious one. They would say, well, this is obviously this has to do with socialism. Socialism is the culprit. Socialism is what caused Venezuela's economic collapse. Well, it's undoubtedly true that if you engage in socialist policies, mainly state control of the economy, you will get these kind of outcomes. But we've seen socialist policies in Latin America in the past. As a matter of fact, you've seen socialist policies in Venezuela in the past, but we haven't seen this. The next explanation that you'll often get, well, this has to do with narco trafficking. This is a criminal government. It's pretty much a government that's engaged in all kinds of illicit activity, and it's a narco state, or a criminal state. So that's why they're doing this, because they want to destroy the economy, because everything that they do is outside of the formal economy. It's in the informal economy, and this gives them more power. Well, we've seen narco states in Latin America. We all remember Manuel Noriega in Panama. And matter of fact, I believe there are narco states in Latin America at this present, but most narco states that I remember are very quiet. They don't seem to make a lot of noise, because obviously the activities that they're engaged with, the illicit activities they're engaged with, are not conducive to these type of political crises. Then the more, I think, the bigger explanation that you get now is, what's the Cubans? The Cubans are absolutely involved. That's what the Cubans are doing this. And I want to be careful how I say this. It is, at this point, in November 2019, undoubtedly true and irrefutably the point that there is a Cuban occupation inside Venezuela. There's a Cuban control of many institutions within the Venezuelan government. There is a you call strategic alliance with Havana that has ongoing. That's gone past Hugo Chavez, who died in 2013, and succeeded onto Nicolas Maduro. Yet we've seen Cuban occupation in Latin America. We all remember Grenada in the 1980s. These ingredients to me, were insufficient to describe what is going on in Venezuela. And I think for many folks that are knowledgeable about Venezuela, I think also can agree that there's more to this. There's something more to this. So this kind of pushed me to go into a different angle and to look. And I wanted to get into a bit of the origins. Oh, well, skip myself. Well, anyhow, you guys already got the punchline, so I'll skip the punchline. And essentially what I would do often when I did that part of the presentation was I would talk about, in my trips to Latin America, my visits with these military foreign counterparts in defense in different countries, in order to engage their thinking and in order to build this synergy with what's going on in the world, I constantly would tell the story. And I tell the story about the origin of the Bolivarian Revolution. But when I would tell the story, I would tell it kind of in a very personal way, and a story I think that many in Latin America can understand. It's the story of a lieutenant colonel. A lieutenant colonel who wanted to take power by force, but failed. Then got elected as president, and immediately used his position as president to take over the natural resources and take the profits to start his revolution, first domestically, then exported it abroad. And all the while accusing his opponents of aggressors and imperialists and capitalists. And this president was in power, Lieutenant Colonel turned president, was in power for 14 years, not before passing away for natural causes, but leaving a legacy of crime, corruption, and conflict. So I tell that story anywhere in Latin America, and it's undoubtedly the same. You're talking about Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez. But that story is identical to the story of Lieutenant Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser. And the reason I tell that story that way, and the reason I make the similarities with Nasser, is because Nasser and Chavez are tied by history and migration. These are important connections to understand how the Bolivarian Revolution was formed, the way it was shaped, and the inspiration it took in terms of its strategic orientation. So I'm going to go, and I realize I don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to go very kind of quickly through a lot of this, but what I would like to do, and hopefully this works, we didn't test it out before, but I want to play a short video because other than hearing it from Joseph Humire, it's kind of a little bit impactful also to hear it from the people who worked the revolution themselves. So hopefully this works. If it doesn't, I'll just skip through it. And it did work. Give me 1 second. Yeah. Okay, we'll skip through it. Essentially what that was a video of Hugo Chavez in an interview in Syria during one of his first trips to Syria in 2006, where he was asked about the legacy of Nasser, about the legacy of Arab nationalism, and he gave a very long-winded answer that we truncated to about 45 seconds, to where he said, he identified his understanding of Arab nationalism, his appreciation for Nasser. He extended it to Assad in Syria, understanding that the Ba'athist movement was born out of this, and then at the end of the video says, I feel like I have Arab blood, in a way that I'm not doing it justice the way I'm saying it, in the way that only Hugo Chavez could say it. And some of you, I think, that have seen this variations presentation will see that video. I can send that video to Paul. It's part of a historical archive that my research team has dug up from Jordan, actually, that we are looking to make public in the near future. Nonetheless, what did he mean when he said, I have Arab blood? I think nominally he didn't take a 23andMe and figure something out that none of us know. I think really what he means is he understands the history of the Arab struggle. It goes beyond what is Iran and Hezbollah today, because Iran was born in 1979 and Hezbollah in 1982. What he means is he understood the strategic orientation of the Middle East as it evolved in the 20th century. Because before the Iranian Revolution, what dominated politics and conflict in the Middle East was the rise and the fall of Arab nationalism, which was what Gamal Abdel Nasser sparked. So there's three things within the Arab nationalist movement in the Middle East that are important to realize and how it reflects within the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. The first is strategy. The second is concepts, and the third is symbols. In terms of concepts, for those that look at Venezuela, everyone knows that Chavez used the concept of Gran Colombia. The Pan-Americanist unification of Latin America, I think 4 or 5 countries within Latin America, to unify them under one social cultural identity. Well, that's not an original concept. The concept of Greater Syria is very much the same thing. It's the Pan-Arab unification of Egypt and Syria, which actually, if you remember, Nasser was successful. Nasser did unite Egypt and Syria and created what's called the United Arab Republic for a period of about 10 years in the 60s and 70s. Evidently it didn't last, but he understood in the historical tense of natural Syria versus Greater Syria. And if you look at natural Syria, which goes back to the 7th century, and what the Ottomans used as Greater Syria to take the Arab Rising, it was fundamentally important to the history of the Middle East, which goes into symbols. Obviously, the one in Venezuela that's most known is Simon Bolivar, and obviously Hugo Chavez. In that video, it's actually an hour-long interview that I will send to Paul that everyone can get a chance to take a look. Chavez does an interesting comparison where he mentions Simon Bolivar as a liberator of the Venezuelan people. We all have heard him talk about this before. But then he makes an analogous comparison to Sultan Pasha al-Atrash, an individual that probably most folks do not know, especially Latin America observers. Well, Sultan al-Atrash considered to be the liberator of Syria. Because during the Arab Revolt in 1910, al-Atrash worked with the British to be able to ensure that the Ottomans did not take over Syria. Al-Atrash is a Druze. He's from southwest Syria, and he's a hero in the history of Syria. Assad was named prizes and other things after Al-Atrash. And Al-Atrash was a defender of the Greater Syria concept, understanding what's natural Syria to Greater Syria. So Al-Atrash, what was interesting, not just the comparison, but what was interesting to me was the use of the symbol. Because the symbol of Al-Atrash, beyond being the liberator of Syria, is also a very important symbol in a specific ethno-religious minority, which is the Druze. The Druze is not well known in many regards. They're a very secretive culture, sort of like a culture without a country. They exist along the tri-border of southern Lebanon, southwestern Syria, northern Israel. But they have one of the hardest things to do in the world in terms of survivability. They have to work with three opposing factions. They have to work with the Israeli government. Obviously, they're very close to the IDF and the Jews in Israel. They have to work with the Assad government, those that are in Syria, and then they have to work with the Lebanese government. And in some cases, because in the southern part of Lebanon, some of the Jews work with Hezbollah. So in that sense, they're naturally in conflict. And what was interesting when you start to study the history of Sultan al-Atrash is not so much what Sultan al-Atrash did, but what he didn't do. One of the things about the history of the Druze, and this is something that our fellow colleagues from the Middle East would love to engage you on, is the Druze understood that since their most important thing to them is the survivability of their people. So when the Ottomans were looking to basically take over the Middle East, they understood that the best strategy for them to survive this conquest was to A, fight it, but B, infiltrate it. So the Druze actually worked against the Ottomans in Sultan al-Atrash's case, but then the Jews from northern Lebanon worked with the Ottomans. And that is something that's not very well known into the history of the Arab Revolt, but it has been documented. I spent 2 weeks with the Druze in northern Israel, and it's something they don't talk about very much, but it brings into a concept something that I think is very relevant to the Bolivarian Revolution, which is the concept of insurgency. When you talk about insurgency, there's a tactic that's fundamental in insurgencies, which is compartmentalization. Compartmentalization is nothing more and nothing less than when you take different cells within a network and you compartmentalize them to work towards a common objective through different means. Very simply, if we were one network here and me and Paul fabricate a fight, we pretend like we're enemies now, and then I defect and I go work with our enemy of IDP. I don't know who the enemy of IDP is, but I go work with another university, and then I work my way up to become close to the leadership of that university, and then we start competing, but me and you still have an ability to work together. That's compartmentalization, and that is something that is the insurgency method, and the compartmentalization tactic is something that is streamlined within the rise of Arab nationalism, and it's something I think is very important to understand when we get into the model of Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution. This is a longer history that I don't have the time today to go through, but what I want to do is I want to tap it into migration because that's a little bit more concrete. This kind of movement that existed in the Middle East in the 20th century found itself into Venezuela, more recently through an individual that some of you may know, Tareck El Aissami, or what's known as Carlos Zaidan in Venezuela. You may recognize his surname because he is the father of Tareck El Aissami, who is the former vice president, current minister of Industries, National Production. They call him a Mufi because Carlos Zaidan arrived in Venezuela not as just a regular migrant or a refugee. He arrived in Venezuela because he was part of a political mission. When Carlos Zaidan arrived in Venezuela was at the period of time when the Ba'ath Party split in the Middle East, when the Ba'athists that were originated out of Syria, born out of Syria, compartmentalized and fractured to move on to Iraq. There you see Michel Aflaq, one of the co-founders of the Ba'ath Party in Syria, Shibli Al-Aissami, also a co-founder of the Ba'ath Party in Syria. Shibli Al Aissami then goes to Iraq and becomes the Secretary General of the Iraqi branch of the Ba'ath Party. You can see Saddam Hussein right behind him. And at the time that Shibli Al Aissami moves over to Iraq, they send his nephew, Zaidan Amin Al Aissami, to Venezuela to create the Ba'ath Party Venezuela. But in actuality, in some of the text, what it was described, it was the Ba'ath Party Colombo Venezuela, which is why they sent him to the border. That's him right there. Okay, so there's 3 periods of mass migration from the Middle East to Latin America. The first is around the year 1880. This is when the Ottomans began to make their major push against for conquest of the Middle East, and there was a tremendous amount of persecution. That persecution obviously led to a mass outflow of refugees. A lot of those refugees landed in South America. Particularly, they landed in Argentina, Colombia, and Venezuela. In fact, one of the common terms for those that are from the region, from Latin America, I think you guys know them as Turcos, right? And you call them Turcos because they actually aren't Turcos, but a lot of them had Turco documents because it was Turkey, Ottomans, that was handling the documentation of the refugee outflows. So a lot of them were actually Armenian, were Maronite Christian from the Middle East that were being persecuted by the Ottomans, but they would lose their documentation. They would come as refugees to this part. In fact, the tri-border area in the south of South America and the intersection of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay is originated from this migration. The next period is from 1910, which is the Armenian Genocide. And I think someone I met from Armenia recently now. The Armenian Genocide, which was obviously the word genocide comes in the UN vernacular from the Armenian Genocide, comes from that period. Another wave of mass refugee outflows kind of hits Latin America. This time more to Colombia and Venezuela and Mexico. And then the more recent wave of mass refugee outflows from the Middle East happened between the period of 1960 to 1970, which that was when basically the Ba'ath Party was solidified itself into Syria and then later, much later into Iraq. Obviously the beginnings of what became later the Lebanese Civil War, and many people escaped. During this mass migration, during this outflow that happened to Latin America, that came to Latin America, and this is something that's very synonymous, that's just in this case, but it's synonymous in almost all refugee cases when you look at mass refugee outflows, is what's called rat lines. Right? Rat lines are evacuation routes. Most popularly known what the Nazis, actually, as a matter of fact, this rat line is what the Nazis took after World War II to come into South America. But a rat line was established where rat lines are used from intelligence concepts, not just for the movement of personnel or terrorists, it's for the movement of networks. It's a clandestine network design. And within that, there was this particular arrival in Venezuela of certain individuals that we really don't know who they are. One of those individuals is a gentleman named Mehmet Chagin Simon. For those familiar with Venezuelan history, you might know him as Simon El Árabe. He is most famously known as the individual that liberated the heads of the Communist Party of Venezuela from the San Carlos prison, I believe it was in 1967, when he broke them out of the prison. He apparently arrived in Venezuela in 1962 as a Syrian refugee. He was fleeing the oppression of the Arab nationalists, of the Baathists in Syria, and he arrives in Venezuela. But it's very curious because while he's fleeing the Baathists, which were also socialists, he's freeing the Baathists in Syria, and he arrives in Venezuela to work with the socialists in Venezuela. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of coherence. Nonetheless, he liberates them there. He literally dug the tunnel from the San Carlos prison. He bought the store across the street. He talked to the security. He infiltrated the prison guards and dug the tunnel and broke out Tito Pekoff and the others that were in that prison. But one of the most important things to examine is this is an inflection point. And matter of fact, if you ask me, I think this is an inflection point to what later then became the Bolivarian Revolution. Because up until that point, for those that are some very, very knowledgeable Venezuelans here, up until that point, the Venezuelan communists, the Venezuelan guerrilla movements, the Fuerza Armada de Liberación Nacional, was intent to fight against the Venezuelan armed forces through guerrilla warfare. A very Cuban-like strategy to draw in the military into the jungles, ambush them, and then fight them much the way the Cubans tried or did successfully in Cuba, in the island. Nonetheless, it didn't work in Venezuela. Venezuela is much different. It's a bigger jungle. It's a different geographic landscape. The terrain is very different. And obviously, our military is much different. So it was unsuccessful in Venezuela. But what you see here in this inflection point is you see a change from guerrilla warfare to insurgency. Very different. And for those, you students of national security, of irregular warfare. And what you see is kind of a distinction between the Cuban method and the Cuban strategy and a more adaptation towards the Arab method and the Arab strategy. There's actually stories a lot about how Che Guevara went and traveled to meet with Nasser and asked him, said, listen, I want to go to Angola. And he said, oh yeah, you want to be a white man and go to Angola and take over a revolution. He said, and Nasser laughed a lot of this. He said, this does not work. Guerrilla warfare does not work. It did not work in Angola. It didn't work in Bolivia. And it's not going to work in Venezuela. And what you see there is that don't fight your military, infiltrate them. And then infiltrate your military, take them over from within, use the military to take over the country, and then spark your revolution. So that is the origin of what I think was a period where the Bolivarian Revolution was born. I'm going to fast forward a lot for the sake of time, but the last period of migration that I didn't mention is the reverse migration. And this coincidentally starts in 1999 when Hugo Chavez comes to power. But now it's not migration of Middle Easterners coming to Venezuela, but of Venezuelans going back to the Middle East. And what you see here is you see communities, diasporas being born in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, of Venezuelans, to the point that in one part of southwest Syria, Asawaida, which is both a region and a city, it's 65 as of the 2010 census percent Venezuelan-born Syrian dual citizens. So that my researchers have visited Asawaida, that picture comes from there. It literally is a place where you speak Spanish and Arabic, you eat arepas and falafel, you dance, multiple music. You live like a Venezuelan in the heart of Syria. It's a Jewish-controlled territory, and it's a very strategic area for the Assad government, currently under the Syrian civil war, under protection from Russia and Hezbollah. And this was a very strategic area because this is just the beginnings of what you need to understand to get a sense of who Tareck El Aissami is. And before we even talk about what is Hezbollah, because you can't understand what Hezbollah is doing in Venezuela, what Hezbollah wants in Venezuela, or anything like that, or Iran, until you understand this history of the strategic relevance of Tareck El Aissami to that. When you look at Tareck El Aissami, now obviously his father reformed, his grandfather, his great uncle, and his grandfather before him were mostly revolutionaries and fighting in the fight. But if you see Tareck El Aissami's ascension into the power structure of Venezuela, you begin to see a kind of a rapid rise, particularly since 2004. He becomes the he becomes the vice minister, then the minister of interior, then later becomes the governor of an important state in Aragua, on the coast of Venezuela.
Right.
Then he becomes the vice president, and then he becomes the minister of industries. Now, from a Westphalian perspective, you look at that and you see those are ups and downs. Vice president might be the top, but if you follow it from kind of a strategic sense of what is the power structure inside Venezuela, what you begin to see is he increasingly controlled first the security apparatus in Venezuela, being as Ministry of Interior, and then became to control the economic apparatus inside Venezuela, and has begun to connect the two. There was a documentary in CNN that I helped them produce, which is called Passports in the Shadows. It was aired both on English and Spanish by Anderson Cooper in English and Fernando de Rincon in Spanish, which I recommend you all look at. It has a lot of this material, some of it in it. But in that documentary, in the process of doing that documentary, when we started examining Tareck El Aissami, what I realized is that a lot of his ascension had to do with his wife. Rudy Amar Alman Al Aissami, is very important in the Druze dynasty. Matter of fact, the Almans come to the origin of the Druze from the 11th century, of the unification also with the Persians from that period. So what you see is the transformation of an individual that was a revolutionary to a prince. And in the Middle East, those that have blood lineages to fortunes and territory are those that get access to that territory. And I believe a little bit of what I'm describing here is how this is playing itself among a triangle that's established in the Middle East of Turks under Erdogan, Persians and Iranians under the Ayatollahs, and the Druze under Tareck El Aissami, which makes him he's the third leg of that table, and that makes him a very relevant player in the Middle East. This doesn't come out, right? I always say that.
You don't need to rush too much. We're doing pretty well. So
is that right?
You want to keep another 15 minutes or something. We're good.
Okay. Oh, we'll see where we get to, and then we'll probably open it up to get some dialogue with folks. This is all distorted a little bit, but essentially, the term that you hear, the country reports on terrorism, the most recent one that was just released, I think about a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, from the Department of State, lists in the country reports on terrorism on this section of Venezuela that there is Hezbollah facilitators and supporters. Now, let me break down those terms. In the counterterrorism community, you have something that's called the convergence, right? The convergence is organized crime and terrorism. And for a long time in the history of counterterrorism, many analysts thought that this was never going to happen. They thought that, criminals and terrorists have completely different objectives, right? And motivations. Criminals are motivated by greed, and terrorists, especially the Islamist terrorist variety, are motivated by God. So they're not going to do the same thing. And they were almost right. They were actually mostly right. Terrorists are not just abandoning the jihad and becoming criminals, and criminals are not, just taking up the flag of jihad. But what you're seeing is when the two kind of cohabitate, you're seeing a logistical industry develop, where service providers essentially become equally beneficial for criminals as they are for terrorists. If you think of it from just a very basic sense, if you're a lawyer for the FARC, you could be a good lawyer for Hezbollah, or a technician or an accountant or whatnot. So in the counterterrorism community, this is known as the financiers, the fixers, and the facilitators. So that's kind of in the context of what you look at when you look at Hezbollah supporters. As I think the Department of Treasury and others are going to start mapping these networks inside Venezuela, you're going to see more of these. Now, they're not card-carrying Nasrallah-approved Hezbollah members, which, by the way, Hezbollah doesn't carry cards, so it's hard to know who's what. But they're folks that work within the logistics of Hezbollah, or what the Department of Treasury likes to call as Hezbollah Incorporated. And so in that, within Venezuela, what we're examining is a sub-state criminal structure, which is a civic paramilitary criminal structure that's divided into 8 regions, and where Hezbollah plants themselves into those regions. What you tend to find is there's, on the illicit side, on the military side, and on the governmental side, very prominent players of Arab descent that wouldn't categorize, you would not categorize them as Hezbollah members, or even Hezbollah operators, but you could categorize them as Hezbollah supporters, which is equally as important in this counterterrorism context of the convergence. One of those operators, or one of those supporters, is a gentleman named Ghazi Nasr al-Din. He's actually the first individual that was ever sanctioned by the U.S. Department of Treasury as a Hezbollah facilitator. And all the way back in 2008, one of the first sanctions against Venezuelan officials was ever leveraged. I think Pollo Carvajal was also sanctioned in this same period. Ghazi Nasr al-Din at the time was what we call the Ministro Consejero, kind of like the deputy chief of mission in the Venezuelan embassy in Syria. He's of Lebanese descent. You see him here in a picture that he tweeted in 2011 when the start of the Syrian civil war, under the caption, "Syria resists." You see Nicolas Maduro in the picture, there's Bashar al-Assad, Rafael Ramirez is in the back, there's Ghazi, there's obviously Hugo Chavez. What you tend to find about Ghazi Nasr al-Din is how much actually we don't know about him. I've been looking at him for a long time. When you get to like his birth certificate, you get to his full name. It's Ghazi Atef Salami Nasruddin Abu Ali. So when you break down that name, right, Ghazi means warrior, right, from Lebanon, in the Middle East, right, Iraq, Lebanon. Atef is the name of his father. Salami is the name of his clan. Nasr, nationalism. Din is a city in Mount Lebanon. Abu Ali is the son of Ali. So if you transliterate his name, it's a nom de guerre. It means the warrior from Lebanon. We don't know who Ghazi Nasr al-Din is. And as of recently, what we detected is Nasr al-Din's movements in Colombia, Mexico, Dominican Republic, and Costa Rica. So he is what I would describe a Hezbollah, more than a Hezbollah supporter, a Hezbollah facilitator that develops these networks. He develops the networks that move refugees, move routes, move products, move people, but also do propaganda along the way. He has, ironically, a think tank in Venezuela. It's called Global AZ, that really doesn't produce any research or any analysis, but nonetheless has a Twitter account that tends to be very vocal when it needs to be. But I think one of the things that came out in the CNN documentary that's tied to Ghazi and Tareck was the idea of documentation, was establishing, the way it was told, the story was told in the CNN documentary, which I think is correct, but again, maybe a little bit incomplete. Again, it was just a short documentary for television purposes. But they described it as a scheme potentially between the Venezuelan government and the governments in the Middle East to provide documentation, namely passports, but other documentation to suspected members of terrorist organizations, namely Hezbollah. When you look at those documentation and when you get into the heart of it, this is just a sample. What you tend to find is the surnames. Beyond being just the documentation, to give someone, an operator from Hezbollah, a passport. Hezbollah didn't need that. Hezbollah had tremendously for the Army attack way back in the 90s. They had abilities to get documents from other governments in the world. Matter of fact, they used Greece at one point to get documents. They had ways to embed into the corrupt networks and get government documents to provide cover and concealment to their movement. What Venezuela provided was the ability to create identities, which is much different. For those that work in the intelligence community or are familiar with it, it's the cover platform to be able to create the legend. And when you look at the names, this may be a little small, so you got the Husseinis, the Nasruddinis, the Al-Atrashes. These are prominent names in Lebanon and Syria of families that have established fortunes in the Middle East. So this is beyond this is not just about Hezbollah. This is beyond the establishment movement of terrorists or criminals. This is actually establishing a dual diaspora that's connected through money and movement. And if we've documented over 173 of these cases specifically. Some go with the full suite of records from birth certificate to bank account, and some of them just have a limited amount of documentation. But mapping the family network is what's important. And that'll leave me with Iran, because I think, and this I'll start to end with this so we can get into some Q&A. But when it comes to Iran, with all the context of what I said, if you took anything away from the last 20, 30 minutes of what I've been talking about, is Syria is very relevant for Venezuela. In fact, if you want to understand Venezuela, study Syria. They were designed the same way. If you were to describe Syria in one sentence, it is a humanitarian crisis with the largest refugee outflows in the world, with increasingly occupation of Iran, Russia, Hezbollah, and now Turkey. But that definition is also fitting Venezuela. And the reason why the Iranians will fight literally to the death to protect Syria is because it's a logistical hub. It's the bridge, as they call, between Lebanon and Iran, the land bridge that's increasingly being populated. The concept of what we understood for Syria was that what we thought, is kind of analogous to the Venezuela concept. We thought it was a terrorist state with Iranian occupation. We didn't factor in all the geopolitical other elements, and we thought a weaker Assad would be an easier Assad to be removed. And what happened 8 years later of civil war and conflict in Syria? We found that a weaker Assad, not necessarily Assad easier to be removed, but a weaker Assad is an Assad easily controlled by external state actors. That's a lesson that we need to learn when it comes to Venezuela. So if Syria is the land bridge for Iran in the Middle East, then Venezuela has converted itself into the air bridge. One of the things that's most known to the public is something that's called, that was dubbed in the media as Aeroterror, was a weekly flight that would go from Iran to Venezuela. It was a code share between Iran and Conviasa, the national state airlines. And it would fly about once a week, with literally no passengers. People that would try to buy tickets, they would inflate the tickets to prices as high as about $10,000, $20,000, prices that no one really paid to go to Iran. And then the most interesting aspect of that was when you go to the balance sheet, you find out that they lost more than $30 million in 3 years, so it wasn't commercially viable. But most importantly, it was subsidized not by the Ministry of Transportation, which you would suspect to subsidize a national state airline, but by the Ministry of Mining, which gives you a hint as to what they're going after. I'll skip this. And then lastly, I think to make kind of my concluding point is I think there's a lot of lessons that we could draw from the Middle East, particularly when it comes to Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria. But we have to first understand the origins. We have to understand how this was developed both in the Middle East, how this came to Venezuela, and then we have to establish the analytical lens to be able to learn from the lessons in the Middle East and not apply them in Latin America. This is about networks. These networks are trans-regional now. They move all around the world, not just for criminal purposes, but for strategic purposes. There's intelligence, state support that's been provided to these networks that allows for them to establish what you see in the Middle East as basically Hezbollah incorporated all throughout Iraq and Syria, and increasingly starting to see that in Latin America, particularly in Venezuela. So with that, I'll shut up, and then I will let you guys ask me some questions, because otherwise I'll just keep talking like a parking meter. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Just raise your hand, identify yourself, and Joseph, you can just choose whoever you want.
All right, don't be shy. You go. Yep.
Hi, how you doing? My name is Alberto Espinoza. My question is regarding Nicaragua and the Ortega dictatorship. Where does he fit into all this? Is there any Hezbollah influence in Nicaragua at this time? Does he have any close connections to one of this?
So I am not as familiar with Nicaragua. It's one of the, so it's, with the Bolivarian alliance, one of the countries that I didn't look at as closely as I should have has been Nicaragua. I've focused a little bit more on Bolivia. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. It's been a little bit in the news right now. But I have a lot of colleagues that have looked at Nicaragua. And one of the things when I was at the Special Operations Command, when we were talking about this, you had some folks that looked at Nicaragua very closely. One of the things they first grabbed from this, they're looking, it started to crystallize certain concepts or certain things that they've seen throughout history. And one of the things they brought up to me, they said was about Gaddafi. They said, we always kind of knew, the Cuban influence was always well known, and obviously the Sandinistas and the historical part. We said, but no, something that not a lot of people really talk about was Gaddafi's influence on Ortega. Gaddafi had a tremendous amount of influence on Ortega, to the point that they say that Gaddafi's son, I think, either lived or once lived in Nicaragua, right? And then they said, Joseph, where does Gaddafi fit in all this? And I said, well, if you look at what Gaddafi was when it came to the Arab nationalists, he was a supporter. Him and Nasser literally established the non-aligned movement. So I think in that context, I haven't looked at this construct in Nicaragua. But to be honest with you, I didn't look at this construct in Venezuela for a many long time. In intelligence, they have a saying. They say there's no such thing as bad intelligence. There's only bad questions. If you don't ask the right questions, you do not get the right answers. And I don't engage in intelligence, but in my research and my center's research, we weren't asking the right questions. We mapped Tareck El Aissami's network back in 2013. We established the financial hubs that he was using out of Jordan in the Middle East, out of Curacao, and out of Panama in Latin America. We knew down to the banks and down to the movements of how that illicit enterprise was working. Nonetheless, did any of that really matter? Because it wasn't until 2016 that we hit a wall. At some point when you're doing network analysis, it's just, for anyone that's ever done that, it's frustrating because it's like whack-a-mole. That one and another one grows, that one and another one grows. So you just kind of you lose your mind after a while, and especially these networks, which are multidimensional, they're huge. So we started to realize, what's the purpose of mapping this huge network, and how are we not even go after it? How do you go after something like that? You can't sanction everything. So I started thinking, let's go back to the drawing board. Where does family come from? How did they get to Venezuela? Simple questions, right? But until you ask those questions, and I honestly believe nobody really asked those questions in Venezuela. Nobody asked the right questions in Venezuela, and therefore we got a lot of wrong answers. And I recommend those questions be asked in every country, in every case in Latin America, particularly among the Bolivarian alliance, and Nicaragua would be no different. Sir?
I'm Rizwan from Pakistan, and I'm a graduate student, PhD student in the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and my PhD is on Middle East. I'm actually looking at this sectarian inside Islam, sectarian factor like Shia and Sunni, and Iran and Syria. One common point between Iran and Syria, or Iran, chasing after Syria, is not too much petrol or strategic, but sectarian. Iran want to be a champion of Shia Muslim in the Middle East. So where does this sectarian factor in Middle East fit in your?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this has been a lot of the conversation that we've had, is a more nuanced conversation we have with some of the analysts that know this stuff. And obviously there's differences with Syria too. I mean, there's not the level of sectarian divisions within society that there are in Venezuela. There is Druze in both, but there's not a large percentage of Alawites or Yazidis or Kurds or anything like that. So, but going down to this side of the world, the Iranians, the sectarian divisions in Latin America are different, right? They're not Islamic. And they're not, they're all indigenous communities. If you look at Bolivia, for example, there's more than 15 indigenous communities in Bolivia. The most notable are the Aymaras, the Quechuas, the Chiquitanis, and so there's a bunch of these indigenous communities that most people have neglected, and they're part of displaced and disgruntled populations all throughout the region that led to some of the power structures. If you think about the Bolivarian alliance, Correa in Ecuador, Morales in Bolivia, even he wasn't really Bolivarian, but he was suspected to be some of Humala in Peru. And what you see with Iran is they use that understanding that they have in the Middle East of indigenous communities, of sectarian conflict, and they understand and they bring that knowledge to Latin America. One way to describe the Iranian Revolution, if you take the Islamic part out of it for a second, is as a social movement to defend natural resources. That's the way they sell themselves in Latin America. They don't come in, hey, look at the 12th Imam and Mahdi, and we want to. They come in first talking the language that they think the Latin Americans already understand, and then they gradually move into some sense. I mean, at the graduate level, in the country like Peru, for example, they take those concepts of social movements and sectarian divisions, and then they apply the Islamic element later. And they have actually a culture center in Peru called Inca Islam. It's like the Incas in Islam, so it's very not very discreet on the way they described it. But I think that's important to understand, and I think Iran's very nuanced on this. They're very good at this. And increasingly, the understanding of the way they present themselves has to be in a way that's compatible with Latin American faiths as well. So in Latin America, you have pretty much, Christians and Catholics, right, for the most part. And they understand that that's not, mass conversions to Islam, may be a long-term goal, but it's not something that's going to happen overnight. So what you're seeing, for example, in a week, you're seeing, I think at the end of this week, you're seeing the head, it's a kind of like a religious state summit or something like that in Baku, in Azerbaijan. Right, where the head of one of the top advisors to Khamenei in Iran, Ali Akbar Velayati, the former foreign minister, will be traveling to that. The Argentines have recently asked for an extradition of Ali Akbar Velayati because he's wanted, or he's part of the army attack in '94. But what you see when he goes to this summit in Azerbaijan, one of the reasons that it's a very important summit it's the design of that summit is to present an ecumenical approach to religion, right? To basically describe all religions as one religion. And the Iranians have adapted that approach in Latin America. They've adapted the ecumenical approach to all religions. And that's why if you look at the, kind of into the granular of a lot of the converts, the people that they're recruiting, a lot of them are Catholic, and you have to ask yourself why. One and two.
Two questions.
Sure.
State Department. What is the most influential figure in the Druze from your perspective in the Middle East right now?
I'm not a Druze scholar, but I mean, I think the most controversial figure is Jumblat. So, no, I wouldn't be able to answer that. No. No, Jumblat would be the most controversial. I'd say,
The influential,
with Hezbollah?
With the Druze, he's with everybody. I have a different opinion about him, but the
Okay. Well, I mean, what we looked at was essentially to look at the divisions within the Druze of those that work with Hezbollah and those that worked against Hezbollah, right? Mostly in Lebanon, So Jumblats are openly against Hezbollah, but then also have been, pretty much lambasted in all kinds of cases of corruption and other things. And so what we've basically taken a position is, I couldn't describe the hierarchy of the Druze inside Lebanon or Syria for that matter, but what we're looking is to look at where Tareck El Aissami fits in. Because one of my first experiences were that, when you mention this El Aissami, or you mention this the family, is there's not a lot of recognition of him. They say, we didn't know he was there, However, when you get to the Druze in Syria, he's very, very recognizable. Matter of fact, in Asawada, I think they had a street or something named after him, and so he's a very prominent figure in there. I don't know if that comes from his family, his father, his grandfather before him, but what was curious to me, you know probably more about the Druze in the sense of those families are insular, right? So the Lebanese Druze are connected to the Syrian Druze, so it didn't make sense to me that we would know one and not know the other. So that's what we were looking at more. But I have one of my analysts that studied a lot more research into this that could describe that a little bit better.
And my second question, what is us, the United States government, vision from your perspective for Venezuela? What is our plan for Venezuela? We're saying about very broad things.
Yeah.
But what is from your perspective, what is our vision?
I can tell you I can't speak for the U.S. government, right? So I don't know what the plan is for Venezuela.
From your perspective.
What I think the plan should be for Venezuela? Okay, so actually, I think I have a slide up here. This is a little bit longer. Yeah, there you go. That was not on cue, I promise. If you look at the plan, or not a plan, the strategy, right, that the U.S. government used, it's called maximum pressure, right? You guys are very familiar with the Middle East with this because it's the same kind of strategy on Iran, right? It's to delegitimize them to the point where it's an isolation, to really have no legitimacy in the international community, using political pressure, and to choke them financially through sanctions and other economic measures, to the point that you get a point of fracture, like maybe that center point right there, right? But that maximum pressure campaign is built on a premise. It's built on a premise that you have a regime that all they care about is power. So if you have a regime that all they care about is power, then a maximum pressure campaign could work. And I was recently reminded that most maximum pressure campaigns on average are about 1 to 1.5 years, and the one in Venezuela has only been going on for 9 to 10 months. So it's still a little bit premature to say if that's worked or not worked. Nonetheless, I know that there's a little frustration that the maximum pressure hasn't given the results that one would think it has. And there's a similar conversation in Iran. And what I added to that is I think there's a different, if that's not working, then we have to go back to the premise. We have to go back to the assumptions. Are they correct? Is this just a regime that wants power? That's a critical question. Because if you look at it from a revolutionary perspective, there's a concept called anti-fragile, right? Which is the more you pressure something, the stronger it becomes. If you think of it from just like your muscles, the more you work them out, the tougher you become. That there's an anti-fragile component within the Venezuelan construct, the way it's designed, that is, the power is a part of it, but the real part of it's the expansion. So the Bolivarian revolution was designed to expand itself, as revolutions are. There's a difference between revolutions and regimes. Regimes can remain, but revolutions have to advance or they die. And the Bolivarian revolution, at this point, is meant on expansion. It's what you're seeing all throughout Latin America. It's a very well-orchestrated plan that they're executing. I'm not saying they're going to be successful, but they're at least going to try. So I think, in my opinion, what I'd like to see is a counter-revolutionary strategy, a counter-insurgency strategy that's much more broader, regional, global, than just a maximum pressure campaign against one regime. I don't care about regimes. I care about stability in the revolution, or stopping the revolution. I'm sorry, this third gentleman.
Yes, I think there are several economic and political organizations, international organizations in Latin America. I think Mercosur might be one of them, but there are several of them where the United States is not a member. The U.S. is an OAS, but a lot of those other U.S. is not a member. They're often shared by Venezuela or Cuba, and I'm wondering how much the Middle East, either Hezbollah or any Middle East ruler, has influence in Latin America through those organizations.
So there's only one major organization that Iran and Hezbollah has some level of influence over. It's called the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas. So you've heard me use that term, the Bolivarians and things like that. It's kind of become kind of ingrained in my lexicon because that alliance, it exists. It's been there for a while. It started in 2005. It began with Venezuela and Cuba. It grew to then become Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador at a time. Now Ecuador seems to have left, and then some Caribbean satellites. When that alliance began, Iran and Syria were observing members since day one. So they attached themselves to that alliance. And as that alliance, the ALBA alliance, I have a different presentation with different side where it shows the ALBA, it shows all these multilateral alliances in Latin America kind of overlap with one another. And there's only one alliance that the ALBA has no access to, or has up until a point. Now it's different. Now the political winds have shifted. That the ALBA alliance didn't have at least one member in. It has it in Mercosur and UNASUR, and obviously the OAS and CELAC and all these other groups, but was the Pacific Alliance. The Pacific Alliance was designed specifically to not have any ALBA influence in it, and by extension had less influence of Iran or any of the other external state actors. That's changed a little bit because the founding members of the Pacific Alliance were Mexico, Chile, Peru, and I'm probably forgetting somebody. Colombia. However, Mexico has gone a very different direction now. We're struggling a lot with Mexico. For those who are from Bolivia, probably struggling a little more with Mexico in the recent days. And so the Pacific Alliance isn't as strong as a construct as it once was when it was envisioned. So Iran has pegged themselves to that alliance, and I don't know about much of the other alliance. Mercosur is a South American political economic framework. There's obviously some members, but what Iran does is they play the political chess, right? So I'll give you an example in Argentina, right? So for 12 years, Argentina was under the rule of the Kirchners, the first Nestor Kirchner, then Cristina Kirchner. Iran gradually grew its presence through that 12-year period. And obviously it already had a presence in Argentina. We know about the bombings in the 90s. President Mauricio Macri comes to power in 2015. And they understood that that's a challenge. So Iran didn't leave, or Hezbollah didn't, completely retract from Argentina, but they understood they couldn't advance as much as they wanted to. Now things have switched, and Alberto Fernandez is now the president-elect of Argentina, and his vice president is Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. And there's a lot of concern that Iran and Hezbollah are going to entrench themselves again into Argentina. Once again, so they kind of play this they play that political chess. They kind of wait to see which ones. They don't always try to determine the outcomes. But Iran's been in for a long time. In Venezuela, for instance, you know, a lot of people think that this started with Hugo Chavez. You know, some of the Iranian major recruits that were involved in major terrorist operations in the 90s were recruited out of the Iranian embassy in Venezuela, including Abdel Kader next door from Guyana. I'm sorry, sir. Yeah.
So Emmanuel, I research Center for Security Policy. On the Iran nuclear deal. So there was a project Cassandra. I don't know if you know about that.
Familiar.
It was Iran. You know, where Hezbollah were shipping drugs from Latin America through the U.S. into Africa, and the Obama administration ended that investigation to get a deal with Iran, which obviously ended up with Iran getting a lot of the assets and money. I think it was over $1 billion. Do you think that? Well, I mean, in my opinion, I would think that it would have aided Iran's part of Iran's objective in the region. What's your thought?
In terms of the nuclear deal?
In terms of the nuclear deal, how it gave Iran more power.
Oh, in Latin America?
And resources.
So let me just rephrase just to make sure I understood the question correctly. Was the question, did the Iran nuclear deal give Iran more impetus in Latin America?
Yes.
Okay, and then you mentioned Cassandra. Was that because you think Cassandra was one of the reasons? That's one of the reasons they wanted to stop, or the Obama administration wanted to stop Cassandra.
Because Politico wrote an article.
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
And they sort of said that that was part of the reason, and in that investigation was part of the process of getting Iran to
Okay.
agree to a deal.
Yeah. Okay, I think I get it. Okay, so just to make in the context of the nuclear deal, I think that's what we'll look at this. So, it was very interesting actually, because that's actually a lot of the period where I looked at Iran and Latin America, talking about more broadly. I began looking at that in 2010, and so obviously this is before the pre-nuclear deal, but it intensified in 2013, which that's when the nuclear deal really kind of kicked off, and obviously in 2015 when it was signed, the JCPOA. And what was interesting in that is, a lot of calculations early on. When I used to have these early conversations with the military intelligence community about this, they were they were very small conversations with only a few people. Obviously, this room's gotten a lot bigger over the years, but nonetheless, there's a lot of skepticism as to Iran's presence in Latin America. And at the point, for the president that was saw, a lot of the calculation was, well, now that there's these sanctions on Iran because of the nuclear program, that's going to retract them from Latin America, because of economic tightening. This is an expensive thing for you to think about it for Iran, right? To operate on the other side of the world, that can't be very easy financially to do. But what you actually saw was the more we tightened on Iran in the Middle East, or in Iran in the financial, the more they operated in Latin America. Like they actually increased their operations because I think for two reasons. One, because they depended more on Latin America for financial access to U.S. dollars, and two, because they needed Latin America to break the isolation, the international isolation. So they built, at the time that the sanctions were pressuring, the multilateral sanctions regime in Iran gradually grew from about 2008 to 2013. That was the high water mark for the Bolivarian revolution. That was like literally where the Bolivarians really started to become very strong on a regional sense. Hugo Chavez from Venezuela, the Castros in Cuba, and all that. And so I think in that sense, it kind of was a miscalculation on that. Now, how that played into Cassandra and the decline of the nuclear deal. So for those who aren't familiar with Project Cassandra was part of a larger operation in the DEA that was actually an interagency operation to look after Hezbollah's illicit financial networks. What they did is described to me by the head of the DEA Special Operations. It was literally like a monster. It was like you just find one and it just kind of kept growing as you start to unravel it. It became very well known to the public in 2011 by a case that was the Department of Justice, FBI ran, which was called the Amin Juma case, Operation Titan, which was a Colombian Lebanese drug trafficker, money launderer, who was trafficking multi-ton shipments of cocaine and multi-million dollars of money, from Los Zetas cartel in Mexico on behalf of Hezbollah. And what the scheme was essentially, you would basically, you move the drugs, but you would launder the money by buying used cars in Africa and selling them in the United States and moving the financial transactions through the Lebanese Canadian bank that got sanctioned and shut down. And so what you started to see on the U.S. side, you started to see all these used car dealerships started to get developed, which didn't really make much profitable sense, but nonetheless they were active. And you saw empty car lots in Africa where they were selling cars, but there was actually no cars there. So what it became was a major money laundering mechanism for Hezbollah, and that kind of just ended up growing. And the accusation, I don't say the accusation, but the insinuation that the political piece put out was that the Obama administration clamped down on this because they thought that the more this monster grew and the more that the DEA and the other agencies, Department of Defense particularly, understood this, the more they would figure out this was tied to Iran. So in Latin America, in the analytical community of the United States, when it came to Latin America and it came to Iran and Hezbollah, it would constantly be divided into Iran activity and IRGC activity and Hezbollah activity. Not the same, right? The Hezbollah is into the money. They want the drugs. They want the money. They want to get rich. Iran, Hezbollah, they're doing some intelligence stuff, just typical stuff. We don't really know what they do, but they would compartmentalize the two, right? Which didn't make any sense to me because everywhere else in the world, literally look at it like they're together. But for whatever reason, in Latin America, they had to be separate. And I think that started to become debunked over time. Now, I don't know if that was anything strategic by the Obama administration or anything like that. I actually think it's has more to do with bureaucratic issues, infighting between equities among agencies. And for those that aren't as familiar with it, I'm not as familiar with it myself. I don't work in the government, but there's different ways of collection in terms of intelligence. The DEA is the newest member of the intelligence community. They have a different collection platform than other intelligence agencies, and they're also newer to the whole community. And I think there was a lot of concern about the way that they were operating and things like that. And there's, this happens in government, right? You have turf wars, turf battles, as they say. So I think there was a lot of that actually that went on. I'm not familiar or no, but what I can say though is that not a lot of resources were applied to the problem set. And for the little resources that were applied, there were some very smart people that understood very important things about Iran and Hezbollah's presence in Venezuela, in Latin America, that weren't allowed to advance as much as they should.
Anything else?
That's it? Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you guys. Paul, thank you again for your
Thanks
time.
for coming.
Absolutely.
Thank Joseph.